Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. So glad to have you 8th grade historians with us today. We are jumping right into a massive, honestly mind-blowing turning point in U.S. history, the era right after the Civil War. It's a time defined by this incredible, pulling in two directions kind of tension. On one side, you've got these phenomenal constitutional promises of freedom and equality made during Reconstruction, but on the flip side, you've got the harsh, incredibly difficult realities of how Reconstruction actually ended, and how those big promises were challenged on the ground. It's a fascinating story all about law, struggle, and the ongoing, messy definition of what it actually means to be an American citizen. Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover remaking the defeated South, the gains enduring in law, the collapse of Reconstruction, how those rights were undermined in practice, and wrap up with the unfinished question.
All right, Section 1, Remaking the Defeated South. The year is 1865. The Civil War literally just ended, and the nation is staring down this unprecedented puzzle. How in the world do you reunite a country that just tore itself apart? Well, two very different plans popped up. First, President Abraham Lincoln, and then his successor Andrew Johnson wanted a lenient, super-fast reintegration. Johnson basically handed out mass pardons to Southerners and threw together a quick path to readmission. Honestly, by early 1866, Johnson was already announcing, hey, Reconstruction is over. But, hold on. The radical Republicans in Congress completely disagreed. They wanted a much more radical restructuring to actually stabilize the defeated Confederacy and, crucially, extend real citizenship and equality to formerly enslaved people. Talk about massive friction, right? Congress actually forged ahead, overriding President Johnson's vetoes to remake the South on their own terms.
And they moved incredibly fast. During this period of radical Reconstruction, it is just awe-inspiring to see that in a span of only 5 years, Congress passed 3 world-changing constitutional amendments. We get the 13th in 1865, the 14th in 1868, and the 15th in 1870.
Which brings us right into Section 2, Gains Enduring in Law.
These 3 amendments are the ultimate promise of Reconstruction, monumental changes carved right into the supreme law of the land. Let's look at the actual text of the 13th Amendment. It says clearly, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Now, I know what you might be thinking. What about the Emancipation Proclamation back in 1863? Well, remember, that proclamation only applied to areas of the Confederacy that were actively in rebellion. It didn't end slavery everywhere. So this 13th Amendment, this was the final, permanent constitutional hammer that officially abolished slavery across the entire nation.
Then in 1868 comes the 14th Amendment, and wow, this is a massive leap forward. The Citizenship Clause states all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States, period. Just by being born here, you are a citizen. This brilliantly wiped out old discriminatory state laws and officially granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people, setting an entirely new baseline for civil rights in America.
But wait, the 14th Amendment doesn't even stop there. It also packs in these crucial words. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny anyone equal protection of the laws. Why is that such a big deal? Well, before this, your rights were mostly protected from the federal government. This amendment flipped the script and said no, these rights now apply to the federal and state governments. That is a truly unprecedented legal gain.
Okay. Let's take a quick pause check. We just read some incredibly powerful laws. But here's a question for you. Did the 14th Amendment automatically protect everyone's rights in practice? Like, does simply writing a law change reality the very next day?
The answer, unfortunately, is a hard no. As our sources point out, the amendment completely failed to protect the rights of Black citizens just on its own. A law on paper is just paper until it's enforced. African-American citizens, alongside their allies, had to buckle down for a determined struggle. I mean, they had to petition the government, initiate court cases, and fight for decades just to make that written promise of the 14th Amendment an actual lived reality.
And that brings us to the 15th Amendment in 1870. The text says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. For the former abolitionists and the radical Republicans, this felt like the ultimate victory lap. Set free by the 13th, made citizens by the 14th, and now given the vote by the 15th. It looked like the absolute fulfillment of their promises for equality.
But, as we know, history is rarely a straight line of progress. Let's move to Section 3, the collapse of Reconstruction.
we really need to unravel the mystery of how these incredible constitutional promises started to fall apart. You see, for a brief, shining window, the promise was actually working. African Americans successfully exercised their right to vote and even held political office across the South, all the way through the 1880s. It was a huge shift. But then the backlash hit, and it hit hard. By the early 1890s, former Confederate states started taking very deliberate steps to strip away this new political power and ensure a system they called white supremacy.
Which leads us directly into Section 4, Undermined in Practice.
What is truly startling to see here is the sheer contrast between the written law and how states actively and sneakily bypass the Constitution. The 15th Amendment flat-out promised that voting rights could not be denied based on race, but Southern lawmakers knew they couldn't just hit delete on a constitutional amendment. So they changed their practice instead. They brought in clever, highly discriminatory tools, things like totally rigged literacy tests and grandfather clauses. A grandfather clause basically meant you could only vote if your ancestor had voted in the 1860s, which, let's be real, obviously excluded almost all African Americans who had been enslaved at that time. By doing this, they effectively disenfranchised black voters without ever having to print the word race in their new state laws.
Time for our second pause check. We just saw how the states were bypassing voting rights. But what about the highest court in the land? How did the Supreme Court impact the 14th Amendment's promise of equality in the year 1896?
The answer is through a pretty devastating ruling. In the 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court basically gave a giant green light to segregation. They legalized this concept of separate but equal facilities. This ruling piled deep social and economic segregation right on top of the political power that was already being stripped away. It effectively rubber-stamped the Jim Crow system all across the South.
50. Let that number sink in for a second. For more than 50 years after that Supreme Court decision, the overwhelming majority of African American citizens were reduced to second-class citizenship under Jim Crow segregation. That is half a century of constitutional promises being flat-out denied.
This brings us to our final historical era for today, Section 5, the unfinished question.
Because the fight for true citizenship absolutely did not end when Reconstruction collapsed. During those 50-plus years of Jim Crow, African Americans relentlessly pushed back. They organized, major powerhouse groups emerged like the NAACP and the National Urban League, and you had these incredible individual reformers stepping up to lead the charge, brilliant minds like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and A. Philip Randolph. They took the dissenting arguments and those unfulfilled promises from the Reconstruction era, and they essentially used them as the blueprint to fight back throughout the entire 20th century.
Looking at this timeline, you really grasp the sheer scoop of this struggle. The 15th Amendment was ratified way back in 1870. Then we have this massive dark period from the 1890s through the 1950s with Jim Crow disenfranchisement. It literally wasn't until March 15, 1965, that President Lyndon B. Johnson urged Congress to finally pass legislation that would make it impossible to thwart the 15th Amendment. That push led directly to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, abolishing those remaining voting deterrents. It took almost a full century for the federal government to actually enforce the promise they made back in 1870. Crazy, right?
So let's do a quick recap. Congress successfully passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments right after the Civil War to guarantee freedom, citizenship, and voting rights. But as we've seen, a law on paper isn't enough. By the 1890s, former Confederate states undermined those exact laws using literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and Jim Crow segregation, which the Supreme Court totally validated. Ultimately, it took a century of relentless struggle by civil rights leaders to force the federal government to step up and enforce the constitutional promises of Reconstruction.
And I want to leave you with this final transfer question to chew on. We've spent this time looking at the massive gap between the promise of the law and the practice of reality. So, if a constitutional amendment guarantees a right on paper, what elements are actually necessary in a society to ensure that right is protected in practice? Think about it. What does it take from everyday citizens, from courts, from local leaders, to make words on a page actually mean something in our daily lives? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep asking great questions, and I'll catch you next time.